Lesson 7, Triggers. Triggers are routines that fire automatically as a result of an event in the database server. Microsoft SQL Server supports Data Manipulation Language, DML, Data Definition Language, DDL, Triggers, and Logon Triggers, which can be developed either with T-SQL or with netcode and can fire after or instead of the triggering event. In this chapter 1 I'll describe in detail the different types of triggers. Triggers are first and foremost stored procedures in terms of how SQL Server treats them internally. They undergo similar processing phases to stored procedures, parsing, resolution, and optimization. However, triggers do not have an interface, input and output parameters, and you cannot invoke them explicitly. They fire automatically as a result of a statement submitted against the database. Part 1, Identifying the type of trigger. To identify the type of action that fired the trigger, you can inspect inserted and deleted. Of course, if 0 rows were affected, both tables will be empty, but in such a case you'd typically rather do nothing. If at least one row was affected, you can check which table contains rows to determine the type of change. As a result of an insert action, you will find rows only in inserted. For a delete action, you will find rows only in deleted. For an update action, you will find rows in both tables. Create the table T1 by running this code. Run this code to create the trigger TRGT1UD. To test the trigger, run this statement. Part 2, Triggers used with views. Instead of triggers fire instead of the original modification that was issued against the target object. The concept is a bit tricky. These are not before triggers that fire before the original statement actually runs, rather, they run instead of it. The original statement never reaches the target object. Rather, the trigger's code replaces it. If the trigger is supposed to apply some integrity check and the modification passes the check, you will need to write your own code that resubmits the original activity. You can do so by querying the inserted or deleted table. Note that in an instead of trigger, inserted and deleted hold the data that was supposed to be changed. as opposed to holding the data that actually changed. Run this code to create the order details table, populate it with sample data, and create the order totals view, which calculates the sum of the quantity for each order. Suppose that you want to allow updating the total T column and distribute the new value between the order details of the affected order by the same proportions that they had before the update. The following trigger achieves this task. The trigger's code exits if no rows were updated. It then checks whether there was an attempt to update the order ID, OID column. If there was such an attempt, the trigger generates an error and rolls back the activity. The trigger then creates a common table expression, CTE, that joins inserted, deleted, and the order details table. The deleted view holds the value of total T before the update, and inserted holds the value after the update. The order details table is added to the join to gain access to the original quantity of each order detail row, and it also ends up being the actual target of the modification. The CTE's query calculates the portion each order detail row should get based on the original proportions, original quantity, original total quantity times new total quantity, rounded. The outer update statement updates the T column in order details with the newly calculated quantity. Run the following code to examine the contents of the table and the view before applying an update. Issue the following update statement, which doubles the total quantity of all orders. Query the table and view again after the change. Part 3, DDL Triggers, Database Level Triggers. DDL triggers allow you to respond to DDL events issued against the database server. You can use these triggers to roll back schema changes that don't meet rules that you want to enforce, audit schema changes, or react to a schema change in a form that makes sense for your environment. You can create DDL triggers either at the database level or at the server, instance, level. You can create those for particular DDL statements, for example, create table, or for statement groups, for example, DDL database level events. Please consult SQL Server books online for the gory details about the hierarchy of statements and statement groups for which you can define DDL triggers. Database-level DDL triggers allow you to react to database-level events, such as creating, altering, or dropping objects. Here's the syntax for the header of a database-level DDL trigger. Suppose that you want to enforce a company policy in the test database that says that when you create a table you must define a primary key. You create the following trigger to achieve this task. The trigger is naturally created for create table statements. The trigger's code first assigns the return XML value from the event data function to a local variable called @EventData. The code then extracts the event attributes schema name and object name, using SQuery expressions, and it constructs a schema qualifier table name in the @ObjectName variable. Finally, the code uses the object property function to check whether the table contains a primary key. If it doesn't, the code generates an error message and rolls back the table creation. To test the trigger, first try to create a table without a primary key. You get the following error. Then try to create a table with a primary key. Your code will run successfully. Part 4, Database-level triggers and query expressions. As I mentioned earlier, DDL Triggers is one of the mechanisms in SQL Server 2008 that can be used to audit DDL events. The triggers implementation is straightforward. Use query expressions to query the individual event attributes that you want to audit and insert them into the audit table. That's all there is to it. As an example, run the following code to create the auditable events table and the TRG audit DDL events trigger. The trigger is so simple that all it has is an assignment of the event data value to a local XML variable and a single insert statement that inserts the event attributes into the audit table. Note that it also inserts the full XML value in case you want to query attributes that were not extracted individually. To test the trigger, issue the following DDL events. Then query the audit table. Part 5, Server Level Triggers. Server-level DDL triggers can be defined for server-level events. Examples of such events are creation of databases, changes to logins, and so on. You develop server-level triggers in a similar manner to developing database-level ones. In the triggers header, you specify the following: on all server instead of on database. For example, suppose that you want to audit create, alter, and drop statements for logins. Run the following code to create the audit logins table and the TRG audit DDL logins trigger. To test the trigger, issue the following login-related statements for creating, altering, and dropping a login. Next, query the audit table. Do you want to learn new skills in the fastest and most effective way? Visit learnwithvideotutorials.com.